Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We also just started the sale on it again. It's been a few months, so if you have been waiting to sign up for Into the Cryptoverse Premium, now would be a good time to do so, and you can get the lower rate. Let's go and jump in. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Ethereum. It has pulled back into the low 3000s, and so I do want to compare it to prior cycles. Look at it compared to say 2016 and 2019 and 2020, and just try to make various comparisons. This pattern is actually a pattern we've seen happen before with ETH. If you look last cycle, you will see 2 times, in fact, where Ethereum essentially carried out a very similar pattern, and also one that you could account for in 2019 as well. And so, while we will spend a decent amount of time comparing Ethereum in 2024 to 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2020, I do think it is important to remember that this is Ethereum in 2024. So, regardless of the analysis that we go through, regardless of comparisons to prior cycles, every cycle there's going to be nuances to it. It's not going to behave in exactly the same way. So I don't really think you should look at this as sort of the path for Ethereum, but more so these are possibilities to consider. And given those possibilities, are you adequately hedged for those potential outcomes? So we'll first start with 2016. We will then look at 2017, and then we will look at sort of the 2019 and 2020. But I think one of the interesting things about Ethereum is also its Bitcoin valuation. I actually prefer discussing the Bitcoin valuation of ETH rather than the USD valuation. And one of the things that I think a lot of people have struggled with this year is some people want to compare this to 2020. Other people, like me, have preferred 2019 mainly because of monetary policy. But what's fascinating is I don't think either side is entirely correct. I think both sides have some credibility to their thesis. And one of the interesting things, if you were to look at the year-to-date ROI of ETH Bitcoin, so the ETH valuation on its Bitcoin pair, and you compared it to, say, 2019 and 2020, you can see that it's actually right in between those two. And what's more interesting, if you take the average of 2019 and 2020, so a pre-halving year and a halving year, and you overlay 2024, what you'll see is that so far, ETH Bitcoin is mimicking the average of 2019 and 2020. The reason why some people want to compare to 2019 is because it was a halving year for Bitcoin. So why not compare it? And then the other reason that you might want to compare it to 2019 is because of monetary policy. I actually really think that what we're currently experiencing is a combination of the two. But I also think that some people look at 2016 and 2019 and say, well, it has to be 2016. Remember, in 2016, which was a halving year, the ETH Bitcoin valuation, found some lows in the summer months, and it sort of trended slightly up. And then once Q4 arrived, we did see ETH Bitcoin finally go down to the lows. So you can see that we had this very similar pattern occur later as well, right? You have your top, your double top, double top. You set a low, and then you set a low here, and then you spend a while basically flirting with that low, sometimes taking it out, just like it did right there, and then eventually it breaks. And so, when I look at what's been going on over here, I do wonder, because you have your top, you have your double top, you have this initial low, and then you're in this phase here. Now, so far, this phase right here kind of looks more similar to what we saw in 2016, because in 2016, there was also a fake out below the range low, right? You see that there was a low set, and there was a fake out below the range low. It then went back up. It bottomed in June, mid-June, and then basically just went sideways. I mean, it set a high, and then it went sideways and basically, wicked above those highs once or twice for, from mid-June until about mid-September. So it was only about 3 months. If you look at ETH Bitcoin now, you can see that it found this low in mid-May, right? So instead of mid-June, it was mid-May, and then 3 months later, so you'd have mid-May to mid-June, and then June to July. So we're almost 2 months in. Now remember, in 2016, it took about 3 months before it really started to capitulate again. So it's about half of that time, right? It's about half of that time. In 2019, once we, saw a very similar pattern, it basically followed this entire year so far, in the sense that you had an initial low that is set, right? This was sort of in January. Then this one here was in December, right? But you had this low right here. And then you go up and you put in a sort of a double top in January and February. The same thing right here, double top in January and February. You then put in a lower high in May, right? And then a lower high in May. And then what happened is, after this lower high in May, ETH Bitcoin then basically fell off a cliff, and it broke support in July, right? In July. And it was actually like the second week of July, the week of July 8th. This time, you also have this support level down here, but it hasn't actually taken the turn back down yet. It's still holding right now above the bull market support band. So it's a little bit different than 2019, right? 2019 was below it, whereas 2024, ETH Bitcoin is still above the bull market support band. And that's why it does sometimes make sense to compare it to 2016, where you can also see that it got back above that bull market support band for a little while. So again, I think it's a combination, right? I really do. And one of the reasons why I like to look at both is because there's no denying, there is some effect on the Bitcoin halving in terms of the Cryptoverse, but also I think monetary policy plays a role. If you look at, say, interest rates, you can see that ETH Bitcoin ultimately broke support the same month that the Fed cut. Now, what's really interesting is, if you look at this low, when it was set, that was mid-May. So if you go June, July, August, the market changes its mind every other Tuesday. The market currently expects a rate cut in September. So there is a case to be made that ETH Bitcoin, it could still trend a little bit, trend for a little bit above its bull market support band. But I still think, as you get out into September, October, November, December, oftentimes that seasonality favors Bitcoin over Ethereum. And whether you subscribe to the 2019 view, where it breaks down in July, or you subscribe to the 2016 view, where it really broke down in October, you can see that in both a halving year and a post-halving year, we ultimately saw ETH Bitcoin drop durably below those range lows and then hold those for a while and before it actually picked back up. So I do think it is still relevant. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about ETHUSD, because ETHUSD is obviously very different than ETH Bitcoin. One thing about ETHUSD is that if you look in 2016, which we've sort of made the comparisons to 2016, we've made the comparisons to 2019, and we'll continue to do that. But if you look at 2016, you will see that ETHUSD set a high in March, just like it did here, right? It set a high in March, and then it basically went back up to that level in June. Now it looks like there's a wick on here to a higher level. But again, if you're just looking at weekly closes, like that, it does look kind of similar, right? You can see a high in June, and then a high in March, and then a high in June, right? Same thing, right? A high in March and then a high in June. And then following that, ETHUSD then fell below its bull market support band. And coincidentally, it fell below it the week of July 4th, right? You see this wick right here. This was the week of July 4th. Now, we do know that the spot ETF stuff is likely going to be coming up for Ethereum relatively soon. If it follows what Bitcoin did, it would mean sort of spiking up and then spiking down following the launch, right? If you remember what happened with Bitcoin USD, if we just go look at Bitcoin USD, you can see it sort of spiked up into it, and then it sold off. Now look at ETH USD here. Back in 2016, you can see sort of it spiked up in about that third week of July, and then it sold off directly after it. And you can see when it sold off, it basically went back down to the prior low that it had set in late April. Do you see that? It set a low in late April, and then in August, the first week of August, it went back down to that low. So if you were to compare that to this time around, right? If you were to compare that to this time around, you've got your March high, your June high. It was late May, early June, and now you're below the bull market support band, basically the same week as it was back in 2016, the week of July 4th, with the spot ETF stuff is theoretically coming up here in the next couple of weeks. But I do think that, you might see it play out like Bitcoin, where it sort of wicks up on the launch and then sort of wicks back down after the launch. Again, that's what Bitcoin did, remember? It wicked up here, and then it wicked down. ETH USD in 2016, it wicked up in July. It didn't actually take out the prior highs. It just went back to them. You see that? It just went back up to where it was in March. And then it sold off that very first week of August. Now, following that sell-off in August, it then went back up near the range highs before then selling off again in the fourth quarter of the year. And in Q4, ETH USD actually took out all these prior lows that it had been putting in, basically since February 2016, and it wicked even further down to about, from these prior lows, about 15% below the prior lows. Okay. Now, again, that didn't actually happen until the fourth quarter of the year. Now, to give you an idea of what 15% below that would be, if you look at where it was, I guess it depends on if you take this wick or if you just take it from right here. If you take this wick 15% down, we'll put it at 2100. If you take it from here 15% down, we'll just put it at around 2400. Okay, but again, I do think it's a valid comparison to compare it to 2016, mainly because of the ETH Bitcoin valuation and similarities with what ETH Bitcoin is doing in 2024 compared to 2016. Because again, in 2016, ETH Bitcoin did have a very similar fake out below the low, right? I mean, it looks almost identical. You see that right there? A fake out below the low, and then a fake out below the low. You go right back up, and then you trend higher for a little bit above the bull market support band. But I do think eventually ETH Bitcoin will sell back off and then go back down again. I don't know exactly when it's going to start, but I do think that will happen at some point this year. I also think that ETH Bitcoin will likely bottom this year. Some people, of course, would already say that the bottom is in, potentially, for ETH Bitcoin, and they could be right, but I do think there is a reason to believe that ETH Bitcoin could continue to sell off into the end of the year. Two reasons. And again, this is after the launch of the spot ETF, because going into the launch of the spot ETF, you could still have it wick up, right? In fact, one of the common patterns you see with Ethereum is that it spikes and then it sort of grinds back up until it gets close to that first top, and then it finally goes down. But it goes up really quick, and then it slowly works its way back up to where it was previously, and then it sells off. Same thing right here, right? It goes up quickly to this high, and then it slowly works its way back up to that level, hits it, and then sells off once again. We saw the same thing happen earlier in 2024, right? It quickly set a high, it came back down, and then it just sort of slowly worked its way back up to that high before then selling off and going to new lows. What happens if we're seeing the same thing happen again, right? Where it sets a high, it then sells off, and then it just sort of slowly works its way back up close to that prior high. It doesn't have to actually hit it. In fact, in many of these cases, they were lower highs. In fact, all of them, they were slightly lower highs. And the prior high that we put in back in May was around 0.05744. But you can kind of see that same pattern, right? Where ETH Bitcoin is sort of slowly working its way back up near that prior high. But if it plays out like all these other examples, you could still see it sell off later on this year, right? But again, it doesn't mean that the second top is in for it just yet. That could happen on the launch of the spot ETF, but you could imagine how it could play out in a very similar fashion. And this is one of the things about ETH Bitcoin that I think has gotten a lot of people in trouble for the last several years is they get excited about all these spikes, and then they get a second spike, and that really gets people to pile into ETH over Bitcoin. And then eventually ETH Bitcoin, after the second spike, it just sort of sells off, sets a new low, and then we go back to talking about, well, we see people cope about it and say, well, it's holding up well, it's holding up better than last time. But the reality is it still has been bleeding against Bitcoin for a long time. And I do think there's reason to believe now that it could still sell off. One of the other reasons that I think ETH Bitcoin could still see one final sell-off sometime later this year is if you look at last cycle. So we've done a lot of comparisons to 2019 or 2016, but if you look at 2019, you can see that ETH Bitcoin also sold off, but it sold off really July, August, September. This one over here was October, November, December. Either way, I think if it's going to happen like those 2 years, you would expect about a 3-month sell-off. So, it could be July, August, September. It could be, October, November, December. Could be August, September, October, right? It could be something like that. But that is what I would ultimately expect at some point. Now, again, I know that's going to get a lot of pushback, but I still do think that there's a lot to be said about monetary policy. And last cycle, whether you look at 2016 or 2019, but last cycle we saw ETH Bitcoin sell off right as those rate cuts finally arrived. And if the first rate cut doesn't arrive until September, then and if it sells off in September, then maybe that sell off is like late September. So you have basically the very end of September, so October, November, December, and therefore maybe ETH Bitcoin finally bottoms out in December, just before you get into January, where Ethereum typically does a bit better. So we've made the comparison to 2016, and in 2016 we know that at the end of the year it wicked below all those other prior wicks, right? You see that? And so there's a case to be made that you could see something play out similar again, right? Where it just spends a lot of time doing something very similar. You also could make the comparison to 2017 as well, because in 2017 we put in a high, and then we put in another high a few months later. And again, you had your first test was at the bull market support band, and then your second one also tested it. And then in that case, what you'll see is that we got back above the bull market support band, just like we did here, but instead of selling off like 2016 did, ETH USD went up into the end of the year. You see that? So it was a bit different. You have two very similar setups to each other, right? Two very similar setups to each other. One broke down in Q4, the other broke up in Q4. And you see the difference? One broke down in Q4, the other broke up in Q4. Now, 2017 was in fact a post-halving year for Bitcoin. So, theoretically, if it were playing out, if according to, say, a 4-year cycle, you would not expect that type of a move until theoretically 2025. Of course, this cycle has been more accelerated than the others in terms of a lot of the gains. Bitcoin went up a lot quicker this cycle than it has previously. And so who knows what's going to happen. But you could look at both of these setups, right? You could look at this one and say, oh, well, that means it's going to break down. Or you could look at this one and say, well, oh, that means it's going to break up. Both setups were really similar to each other. So it's really hard to know what's actually going to take place in Q4. My guess is that whatever is going to happen will likely take place in Q4. You could still just see a lot of, bouncing around for a while. Now, there is one potential issue I have, though, with only comparing to 2016 and 2017. There's also the 2019 comparison, which is kind of an unfortunate comparison. In that comparison, though, it doesn't really look similar to what we're getting right now, in the sense that, you didn't really set a high and then a double top a few months later, right? You just set you had a high and then you went into a higher high and then it just sold off. However, with that said, you can see that rather than get back above the bull market support band like we did in 2016 and in 2017, we got stuck below it. Do you see that difference? ETHUSD got stuck below its bull market support band. And so I don't really know if we should be looking more at that or at 2016, 2017. The one thing that gives me pause about only comparing it to, say, 2016, 2017 is that a lot of people were looking at the altcoin market recently and saying that, oh, well, it's 2020, and essentially saying that, these altcoins were basically doing right here, right? They were basically, they got a big move up, and then they were just slowly trending above the bull market support band, and they were going to continue higher. But if you look at altcoins, they were doing that. They were trending above that bull market support band, but now they're actually below it, right? Now they're actually below the 20-week moving average. So that kind of throws a wrench into that idea, right? And then you have to wonder, well, if we're not here because now we're below the bull market support band, are we here? Or are we just in mid 2019 right here? Right, in July of 2019, right? In July of 2019, you can see that altcoins got below their bull market support band. If you zoom in, you can see it pretty clearly, right? The week of July 8th, they sold off, and then they basically went sideways for a month before then selling off again and again and again and again. So it's not even necessarily the best comparison to that, because in this case over here in 2020, altcoins did not really go below their bull market support band. And if you were to extend sort of this moving average over here back in 2017, you can see that they were pretty, they're basically just trending higher. Now, we don't have a ton of data, so we can't even go back to 2016 for total 3, but if you look closely, you can see that total 3 was essentially putting in higher lows, right? These levels were putting in higher lows, sort of leading into that final expansion. The unfortunate thing for altcoins at the current time is that they just took out this low, right? This low from April was at 559 billion, but today we just went to 554 billion. So that's actually a lower low, despite the fact that at the time that I'm making this video, while total 3 put in a lower low, Bitcoin USD has not, right? It has not. So I do wonder, I think there is some validity to the 2019 comparison. And I know people don't like that, right? They don't like that because it's, well, damn, it's not a pre-halving year. So why should we compare it to it? It's just, it's too much FUD, etc. But again, I mean, even if it is 2019, it's not like it was that bad. I mean, basically Bitcoin sold off for 9 months and then it went on another crazy rally, right? That topped out in the post-halving year. So I don't really know why that's such a big deal. If anything, if you think about it, if you go to the store, everyone loves it when things are on sale. But with investing, if you suggest a price could go lower and it doesn't, people mock you. And then if it does, people get upset. I guess with investing, it's the one thing you actually don't like when it goes on sale, because when it does, a lot of people get really upset. But I do wonder about, just looking at Ethereum as its 2016 comparison, because, I certainly could see it. I mean, I could certainly see it playing out like this. Basically, essentially what it would mean is that we basically just trend sideways until Q4, and then we sell off in Q4, and then we get another move up in 2025, right? That could certainly happen, right? That could certainly happen. The funny thing about this is that when ETH sold off in Q4 of 2016, Bitcoin was actually going up. And I know that doesn't even compute for a lot of people. And honestly, I would think that this time, because I think they are highly correlated now, more so than they were back then, I would guess that if ETH is selling off, then Bitcoin would also be selling off. But I don't know. I mean, you could always get an example where, the spot ETF launches for ETH and the demand just isn't there compared to Bitcoin. and Bitcoin does well, and Ethereum still struggles, and then everyone gives up on Ethereum, and then it rallies in 2025 in the post-halving year, which is when it always does. But I do wonder about these comparisons because, as much as I know that 2016 comparison is adored, and as much as that 2017 comparison is adored by a lot of people, look, guys, I see it too. Like, I'm not blind to the pattern of sort of setting these highs and then eventually breaking above. That could certainly happen. Remember, once the high was set in March of 2016, it took about a year before we broke through it. And when it happened in June of 2017, it took about half a year. Right? About half a year. If we go look at where we currently are in terms of that high, it's been about, 17 weeks or so. My point here is that it hasn't even been that long based on what we saw previously. Right? It really hasn't. Now, here's the thing though. We had rate cuts in 2019. And a lot of times when you get rate cuts, not all the time, but a lot of times rate cuts occur when asset prices are falling, right? So if the market is right and you're getting rate cuts in September, November, December timeframe, right? If the market's right and you're getting rate cuts, then you could easily see this Q4 sell-off. Now, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting because in 2016, when ETH sold off, it really only sold off for those 3 months. Until then, it was basically going sideways. This was basically going sideways, and it even had a slightly bullish bias, right? It wasn't just going sideways, it was putting in higher lows for the most part, right? I'm sure anyone could have looked at this and thought that it was just, an ascending triangle that was going to break to the upside, and then it broke down. People probably gave up, and then it pumped. The market loves throwing people off. But so it was really only about a 3-month sell-off. In 2019, it was longer than a 3-month sell-off, right? It was actually about a 9-month sell-off if you include the pandemic drop. Now, if you don't include the pandemic drop, it was about a 6-month sell-off where ETH topped in June and it sold off until December. So you could have an example where, it basically just slowly bleeds until December. You could have an example where it bounces again in mid-July and then sort of slowly bleeds until December. And then you could finally have one where it does what it did in 2016, bounces in July, sells off again, and then goes back up one more time before selling off in Q4 again. But I think it's kind of a combination, honestly. I think there's some elements of this, but then there's also elements of this based on monetary policy. And for the people that want to compare it to the halving year of 2020 and say that ETH Bitcoin is following that, the one issue I have with it is in 2020, right? In 2020, ETH Bitcoin didn't bottom until after looser monetary policy arrived, right? We know that if you were to actually overlay net liquidity onto the chart, or actually not net liquidity, I don't want to overlay that. I want to overlay just total assets held by the Federal Reserve. What do I want to look at? Total. Sorry, I need to go over here. Total assets. So if I look at total assets held by the Federal Reserve, last cycle, you can see that ETH Bitcoin didn't bottom until this metric turned around. And you can actually see it really clearly here, right? Draw a line through this, right? You can see that ETH Bitcoin bottomed when the assets held by the Federal Reserve bottomed. But that is still dropping right now, right? And so far, the low for ETH Bitcoin occurred right there, and assets held by the Federal Reserve has only decreased ever since. One way to maybe better visualize that is to look at net liquidity. So if you were to look at like total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin, right? If you look at something like this, what do you notice about it? Right? It's just been bleeding, right? But what do you notice when you overlay net liquidity to the chart? if you move this to the existing pane above, you can see that all Bitcoin pairs are essentially tracking net liquidity, an estimation of global net liquidity. As global net liquidity goes down, all Bitcoin pairs go down. Now, if you track it compared to something, say, like Bitcoin, the jaws have opened, right? The jaws have opened, and you can see the divergence between net liquidity and Bitcoin. But we also saw very similar things back in, last cycle where the jaws opened, right? If you look at net liquidity and you just sort of overlay it with this, there have been times where the jaws open, like right here, but then eventually they can clamp shut. So that's kind of how I think about the cycle, right? At some point in the cycle, the jaws open where the risk assets sort of diverge, right? Look at the S&P 500 last cycle. You see there were a couple of times where the jaws opened between net liquidity and the S&P, and then eventually they clamped shut. Okay? But in order for those higher risk assets, your altcoins, to durably outperform Bitcoin and for Bitcoin dominance to go down, you need something to make the Fed pivot to QE, right? Last cycle, it was this. And that was where we really saw altcoins start to do very, very well, was that pivot to QE. We haven't had that yet this cycle, and so the Bitcoin dominance just continues to slowly grind higher. So, when I look at something like ETH, and I see the comparison at 2016, I see the comparison at 2017, I'm like, hey guys, it could be valid. I'm not gonna try to rain on your parade, honestly. Like, it could be valid. In 2016, you had a couple more sell-offs ahead of you, and then it didn't pick up until the post-halving year. Right? 2017, it basically you got back above the bull market support band in a week or two, and then you had one final rally, and then you had a bear market that lasted a year. Okay? I think where we are is not this. I don't think it's 2017. I think what it is, I think it's a combination of this, 2016, and this, 2019 and 2020. And I'll tell you why. First of all, there's a lot of evidence for the 4-year cycle, right? There is. I mean, look at the last 3 cycles. Bitcoin peaked in Q4 of 2013, it peaked in Q4 of 2017, and it peaked in Q4 of 2021. That doesn't mean it has to peak in Q4 of 2025. There's certainly some evidence out there for a left translated peak, right? We can't deny it. I mean, but there's a lot of evidence for, if it's not broke, why do we try to fix it, right? If you have a peak in Q4 very post-halving year, why do we try to force it to be sometime different? So, the rally that a lot of people are wanting now, what if it just happens next year? And between now and then, the markets just get boring and maybe you'll have another rally when the spot ETF launches for ETH, but you could still see a boring market potentially for the rest of the year. Just like 2016 was relatively boring for Ethereum after that initial pump up in March, right? We saw a pump, it topped in March, and then we didn't really get going again until the following March, right? It was essentially a year later, right? But again, I think it's a combination of this, 2016 and 2019/2020. Now, you might say, well, Ben, there is this black swan over here, right? And you're right. I'm not calling for some type of black swan pandemic to take place. But what I am saying is that, and look, it's kind of one of those things where I have to be careful about how much I talk about it, because I recognize that the path for these things to play out takes years and years and years. And so if I just say it every single day, it's tiresome. It's like, well, it's not actually happening. But there is this reality of, if you look at Treasury yield spreads, they have been fairly predictive for forecasting slowdowns in the economy, right? I mean, it happens a lot. I mean, you'll see the inversion, and then the uninversion, that's when the slowdown actually occurs. And a lot of people are saying, well, it gave a false signal this time. What have I said for 2 years now? It's not the inversion that you have to be worried about. It's the uninversion. The uninversion is where the problem comes in. We haven't had it uninverted yet. If you look at the inversion of the 2 and 10-year yield, it's been inverted for 2 years. What's interesting is it first inverted in July of 2022. And then the Fed paused interest rates in July of 2023. Now it's July of 2024. It's been 2 years. So you might say, well, we haven't had that before. Bitcoin and Ethereum haven't seen that before. Technically, that's not true. Technically, we did see it before. We saw it in 2019, and I do sometimes feel very stubborn about it because I'm like, why do I keep focusing on this? Like why don't I focus on something else? But if you look at 2019, it wasn't as deep of an inversion, but the yield curve inverted. It inverted in 2019. And after it uninverted, the recession arrived, right? So I look at it, and I'm like, well, everyone's saying, well, this, the yield curve, it didn't give the signal this time. It was wrong, right? How can we say, how can we know? I'm not saying that those people are wrong. You could have a soft landing. There are examples of soft landings. In fact, in 1967, we had an inverted yield curve right here in 1966. And in 1967, we did not have a recession after the uninversion. But we still did get a recession in 1969, 1970, right? It eventually happened, but it just took another 2 years, right? It took another 2 years. So, you do have to wonder if it's playing out like that, right? Is it playing out like that where you have your inversion in 2022 and then you don't actually see the effects of all those rate hikes until late 2024, 2025, 2026? That's possible, right? We can't deny that potential outcome, especially considering that this is what we saw in the markets back then. Like, look at this. There was a low in 1966, and then 4 years later, there was a lower low in 1970, and then 4 years later, there was a lower low in 1974. Imagine living through that hell, Imagine living through that. So, I'm not saying that it can't play out like 2016 or 2017. I just think that the ETH Bitcoin pattern looks more similar to 2016 right now than it does to 2019. Because 2019 didn't really have a fake out below the low, whereas 2016 did. That's why I look at 2016. But then I feel compelled to look at 2019 as well, because that is when the Fed started to lower interest rates. And when the Fed lowered rates, just before the Fed lowered rates, Ethereum sold off. And it sold off as the Fed lowered rates. And it looks like we're going to get some rate cuts later this year. I think maybe the question, if it plays out like a combination of this, is when does the final sell-off start? Does it start now? Are we in it? Do we rally again in August? Or do we rally again in mid-July when the spot ETF launches and kind of trend sideways for a few months and then sell off in Q4 before going up maybe in Q1 of next year? I don't know. Right? I really don't. But I do think that this market is trying to throw us a lot of curveballs. And I think that there's a lot of people, honestly, in the 2016 camp because it's a halving year, or the 2020 camp because it was a halving year. And I think there's some people in the 2019 camp because of monetary policy. And I think a lot of people think that you either have to be in one or the other, right? The reality is that it seems kind of like it's both. It seems like it's kind of like the pre-halving year of 2019, but it also kind of seems like it's not as bad. Because if it were as bad, let me go back here. If you look at these asset pairs, if you look at the ETH Bitcoin pair here, here's 2024, and then here's 2019. It's not as bad as 2019. It's a tempered version of it. But 2020, I mean, it's not doing what 2020 did either. It's sort of a more modest version of that. You take the average, you get it. Now look at 2016. 2016 had a huge move up early on. ETH Bitcoin didn't get that this year, right? So that's my main issue with the 2016 comparison, is that when 2016 happened, that big move up that occurred in March of 2016, that occurred commensurate with an ETH Bitcoin rally. You see that ETH Bitcoin rally in 2016? That was actually the first top. See, that doesn't really look like this cycle, because this first top this cycle occurred in December of 2021. That's why I look at it like this. I'm like, well, this looks more like this to me than this little one over here, because this one actually occurred, this top here actually occurred, in these post-halving years, whereas this one over here was in the halving year. And it also played out a lot quicker. The other issue is that I think Bitcoin dominance needs to keep going higher. I do. And that means, unfortunately, for ETH Bitcoin, I think eventually it's going to sell off. I just don't know when. And honestly, like I found myself, I used to spend a lot of time thinking about what other people thought about my views, but I think I'm past that. Okay. I think, look, it's possible that ETH Bitcoin continues climbing back up to the prior high, but I'm not going to concern myself. Honestly, I'm not going to. I think it's going to eventually sell off later this year. I don't know when it's going to start, but 2016 says it likely will. 2019 says that it likely will. Monetary policy would suggest that ETH Bitcoin sells off. Last cycle, ETH Bitcoin bottomed 2 months after the first rate cut. First rate cut, unless they give a surprise one in July, first rate cut's not till September. So what if it just bottoms out November, December timeframe? I could see that. I really could see that. It just feels to me like there's this missing element of the final capitulation of alt Bitcoin pairs that we haven't yet had. And that's the issue for me. Look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. It's never really stopped going down, is the issue. For the altcoiners among us, the issue is that it's never really stopped going down. And I've expressed plenty of views that have been wrong. Hell, I've been waiting for Ethereum to come home for 3 years, and I've been wrong. Hand up high, I was wrong. I admit it. I've seen the comments, when are you going to admit this? I admit it, I was wrong, right? It hasn't happened. And if it does happen, you really have to ask yourself, was it worth it? Was it worth waiting for? Even if it does happen, which there's no guarantee, there's certainly no guarantee that it does. So, you look at a chart like this, and unfortunately, we only have one prior example. And my issue with people saying that this is 2016 or 2020, my issue with it is that, in my experience, altcoins are oscillators at best. And it's hard for me to be on the bandwagon, the altcoin bandwagon, and going back up to the range highs before we go down to the range lows. And I know a lot of people hated these views, but just a couple of weeks ago, alt Bitcoin pairs put in a new low, and I've had so many people say, when are you gonna throw in the towel? Like, hell, it just put in new lows 2 weeks ago. Was I wrong to say that all Bitcoin pairs were gonna bleed if new lows were just put in 2 weeks ago? What about the sort of the counter view? Imagine if I had been bull posting about alt Bitcoin pairs. What excuse would I have then to say, oh well, look, this is a new low, but we're just gonna ignore it? No, they have been bleeding. Altcoins have been bleeding, and they've essentially been bleeding since 2021. They just keep slowly going down. And that was the main issue I had with total 3. If you overlay total 3 onto the alt Bitcoin chart back over here, when alts were sort of trending up on their USD pairs, a lot of people were comparing that to 2024. They're like, oh well, this is where alts are going to go up, because it's just 2020 all over again. It's this all over again. And I said, no, I don't think so. I think we're going to see them go below the bull market support band again. And they have. And I think that the missing component that I think would benefit a lot of people is if they looked at this chart on its Bitcoin pair. Because on its Bitcoin pair, it told you that they were going to lose support, because that's what happened last cycle. When they lost support on their Bitcoin pair, that's when they lose support on their USD pairs, right? And you can see that altcoins have been losing support on their Bitcoin pairs. I mean, they're trying to hold on. They're really struggling to stay above, to stay above 0.4. They're trying to hold on. I'll give credit where credit is due. I tip my hat to the Degens among us. But I feel like it's a losing battle. I mean, I really do. I think they're going to capitulate to the range lows on their Bitcoin pairs. And you can see that when they capitulated to the range lows on their Bitcoin pairs in 2019, the USD valuations sold off for about 6 months, not including the pandemic. And it's already been 3 months. I mean, it was already, March to April, April to May, May to June. And we just started July. So it's been just over about 3 months or so. We could easily have another 3 months of this. And so I think the issue with comparing sort of this move here in 2024 to what happened in 2020 is that in 2020, alt Bitcoin pairs were shooting up. They were going up durably. But in 2024, they've been going down durably. I mean, they just keep going further down. That's why when I look at total 3, I don't, the two most compelling cases to me are we are right here or we are right here. If it's 2017, then maybe we're right here. If it's 2019, maybe we're right there. And if we're right here in 2019, then what it would suggest just sort of a slow bleed for basically about 6 months. So from the high, about 25 weeks. So from this high, it's already 14 weeks, right? 25 weeks would put you in September, in fact, which coincidentally is normally when Bitcoin dominance turns around, is September. So maybe, again, it's dubious speculation. I'll let you on a little secret. I don't know what the hell's going to happen, but maybe you see alt USD pairs slowly go down as alt Bitcoin pairs throw in the towel. Okay? And then you get what you would call a soft landing, meaning it puts in a higher low compared to where it was previously. You see this? Okay. So you have your low, then this would be a soft landing. So you have your lows, and then whatever, that would be considered a soft landing. Maybe by August, September timeframe. This is a hard landing. Hard landings normally take out the prior lows, right? They take out the prior lows. People are celebrating a soft landing. Some people are celebrating a hard landing. For me, I just sit around scratching my head wondering how the hell anyone knows. We haven't even had the uninversion of the yield curve yet. How can we possibly know if it's a soft landing or a hard landing? The predictor of it hasn't actually, the event hasn't even happened. So how can we know, right? How can we know? So I just feel like there's a lot of premature celebrations on both sides, whether you're in the hard landing camp or the soft landing camp. No one knows. Absolutely no one. And the reason why no one knows is because we don't know what the hell the Fed's going to do. Are they going to pivot and start cutting rates before the unemployment rate gets too bad? Or are they going to just sit on their hands looking at lagging inflation indicators and not cutting interest rates? Because if you look at things like bankruptcies and stuff, I mean, it's not like everything's looking that great right now. Again, markets can climb the wall of worry, especially, traditional markets. I'd like to think that crypto, one of its use cases, is almost like a leading indicator. If you look at United States bankruptcies, I mean, they're shooting up, I don't know what they're going to look like when we get the next data for the next quarter, but they're shooting up. And if you look at the unemployment rate, I don't know when the market's going to care, but it's going up. And normally when it goes up like this, it's only a matter of time before it goes from a linear process to a nonlinear process, and it starts to go up really, really quickly. But I don't know where that inflection point is. And I don't know if the Fed's going to start cutting before we reach it to help us avoid it. I don't know. I mean, here's an example. The earlier example we told you guys in 1967, right? We got above the 20-week SMA, and then it sold off and put in and sold off the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate then went down to a new low. You see that? What if that's what's going to happen? What if it goes off and goes to a new low? I don't know. Maybe that could happen. But the issue is that of all these examples, you can find plenty to tell your case, to make your case. The problem is we don't know what the Fed's going to do, and we also don't know how quickly they're going to act, and and if it'll be enough to stop the unemployment rate from continuing to go higher. So I can't, in a vacuum, like I can't just look at Ethereum in 2016 and say, well, this is what's going to happen. And I look, guys, if that's what happens, by all means, I mean, let it happen. I'm sure I would. If ETH Bitcoin goes to where I think it's going to go, I would be likely converting some of my Bitcoin to ETH. And I've said before, I think it's worthwhile to hedge anyways. And I said that when it was at 0.045. Did a video on it. I put out a tweet on it. I said this is where you should hedge in case it doesn't go to 0.03 to 0.04. I still think ETH Bitcoin is going to 0.03 to 0.04. But, at 0.044, you can hedge. At 0.049, you can hedge. But again, I look at a chart like this. I think it looks kind of like 2016 on its USD pair. It kind of looks like 2016 on its Bitcoin pair. It kind of looks like 2019 with regards to monetary policy. So I'm going to say, you know what? I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of 2019, and I think it's a combination of 2016. The issue for me is that a lot of these things we've talked about relentlessly for months and months and months have in fact occurred. It's just that because price action keeps putting in slightly lower highs, no one's paying attention to it. For instance, when did Bitcoin put in its local top? The same time it did in 2019 when gold broke out. You guys remember that? This is an Ethereum video. Why am I talking about Bitcoin and gold? But you guys get it. I mean, this is when gold broke out. That's what marked that local top for Bitcoin in 2019. If you look at it here, when did gold break out, and when did Bitcoin find its local top in March, right? It was when gold broke out, basically. And if you look at USDT dominance, when did USDT dominance? Did it hit the trend line that we talked about at 4%? Absolutely. Did that mark the local top for Bitcoin? Yep. Has Bitcoin taken out this prior high from March of 2024? Nope. Did all prior trend line tags of this trend line lead to larger drops in the market? Yes, they did. Is the USDT dominance now above the 20-week SMA itself? Yes, it is. Is Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance above 73%? Another milestone we talked about for years about, basically. 73%, there it is. Same level, at which point that's when interest rate cuts began a month or two later after blue chip dominance, Bitcoin plus ETH dominance broke out. Bitcoin dominance plus USDT dominance. Is it not at the same level it was at in 2019, just before rate cuts occurred? Absolutely it is. Bitcoin dominance excluding stablecoins? Is it not just trending higher? Despite everyone saying it's not going to? Yep. To me, it looks like dominance is going higher. It looks like altcoins are selling off to Bitcoin. It looks like alt Bitcoin pairs are in the process of capitulating. And because it's not happening as quickly as it did last cycle, people don't really seem to notice, right? Last cycle, it occurred very, very quickly. It was like ripping the Band-Aid off. Just get it over with, rip the Band-Aid off. This cycle, it's just been a slow and painful move down. You might say, well, this is not really that big of a move. Just look at total 3 divided by Bitcoin. Look at that. You see that? Just a slow bleed down. And in fact, this bounce that it got in June, mid-June, was actually at the same level it got at mid-September. And then it bounced up. You might say, well, great. What if it does what it did last time and bounces all the way back up to 0.65? All right, fine. But when it did that last cycle, that was during a Bitcoin sell-off, not a Bitcoin rally. So it was just alts were dropping too. It's just that Bitcoin was dropping more. So those are my views. I'm probably going to be wrong about most of them, honestly, and I'm not going to apologize for it. I can't, I don't know about everything playing out exactly how I think. I think that some of the things I'll say are going to come true. Most of the things I say are going to be absolutely dead wrong, and that's okay. And I'm going to have to just be okay with it. But those are my views. I've explained why. For Ethereum, my expectation is just that, best case scenario is that it basically just chops around between 3K, let's say between 2,800 and 4K for the rest of the year, and then goes up in 2025. More of a medium view, sort of like a more moderate view, would be either going sideways, slightly bearish bias until Q4. And again, it could still trend up in the short term with a spot ETF. I'm not trying to minimize that. And then, sell off in Q4, deal with the uninverted yield curve at some point, and then see something else in late 2025. And obviously, a worst case scenario would basically just be, getting some type of catastrophic event that pushes into a recession like we had in 2020. The issue, though, is because it's been a more long, drawn out process this time. Would the Fed be willing to just shove $6 trillion into the economy again after they saw the negative effects of last time? And I would tend towards no, but who the hell knows? I don't necessarily anticipate that we will always learn from our mistakes, as as the Federal Reserve, and I do think that we are ultimately destined to repeat a lot of our mistakes. And if you look at things like the U.S. inflation rate year over year, you have two examples to look at that are reasonable. You have one example. It's just hard to get a soft landing, right? One example where in the 1970s, you just basically had another wave of inflation, right? That was when the Fed pivoted too soon. You have an example from the 1940s when you had a massive deflationary crash right here, right? You see this deflationary crash right there? That's if the Fed holds on too long. By the way, just train of thought. I'm trying to remember how long that bear market lasted. If you go look at 1946 to 1949, that bear market by the S&P lasted 1,111 days. 1,111 days. Now look at total 3. Let's go take a look at total 3. Because Bitcoin already put in new highs, So, I mean, it's not really falling into this category, but the altcoin market has not. And I'd like to think that altcoins and Bitcoin are essentially in almost two separate different asset classes to some degree. Total 3. How long has it been since the top? I'm on weeks, of course. Let me go to days. How long has it been? It's been 970 days. Or where would 1111 be? Just for interest. Where would 1111 be? November of this year. Late November. You can even look at if you overlay the S&P onto this chart, right? Here it is, right? You can even see that the S&P had sort of a bigger spike up in the election year, right? In the election year, and then it sold off into the post-election year. It bottomed in June, in fact. And actually, the market topped in June. It was June to June. And then it finally took off. But it took a long time. It took a long time to get this inflation out of the system. to really then lead to another phase of expansion. It took a long time. In the 1970s, they pivoted too soon, and then you had another wave of inflation, which no one wants. How do you thread the needle? How do you pivot soon enough to keep the economy from slowing down too much, but pivot late enough to make sure that inflation doesn't just come back in a second wave? It's a tough thing to do. Who knows if it's going to be a soft landing or a hard landing? I think it makes sense to be hedged either way. Those are my views on Ethereum, and basically those are my views on a lot of other random things that I wasn't meaning on talking about. But again, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Links in the description below. We've got thousands of different charts, not just for Bitcoin, but also for a lot of different altcoins too. So you can also have thousands of different reasons why those altcoins could still bleed back to Bitcoin. There are some that have outperformed Bitcoin, but the majority do continue to struggle. And no, I'm not going to go on that tangent. Anyways, those are my views. I'll be wrong about most of it, but that's okay. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.